We're speaking today with Joe Lawrence, who is the Dairy Forage Systems Specialist on Cornell's Pro Dairy team. Joe grew up on a northern New York dairy farm, and then he was a private sector crop advisor and an extension worker prior to his current post. At the recent Dairy Profit seminars at Empire Farm Days, Joe spoke about a strategy for corn silage harvest. One chance to get it right, he said, and the challenges may be greater this year given the weather this growing season. Welcome, Joe. And how does a grower begin to think about harvest this year?
Thank you. I think the biggest point for this year is to think about two different crops in terms of forage quality. We have a portion of the crop that was planted in a somewhat timely manner and should mature for proper corn silage, and that crop will certainly be at a premium for our lactating animals. But when it comes to the immature corn silage that we know we're going to have, we really need to think about that as a second crop, and feeding it, using it for different groups of animals on the farm. And one way to start with that is to work with your advisors, the seed companies you purchase seed from, to look at predicted grow and degree days from planting to harvest for different relative maturity corn silages. And then using that information, you can begin to assess whether fields are, you think they're likely to make it before killing frost, and start to map out for your farm the order of harvest. And I think that's a really valuable thing to be doing in the month of August to put together your plan for harvest sequence, and try to estimate how many acres of each of these different forages you'll have.
You, in your presentation at Empire, you outlined what you called several guidelines for success with the silage making process. They seem to be some excellent points that went over well with the audience. Just hit a few of those highlights for us.
Yeah, I always start with safety, and I know we often talk about that, but I don't think it should be taken lightly. It's a busy and stressful time of year, and our first point should always be to send everyone home safe at the end of a busy day. After that, we get into thinking about harvesting at the correct moisture content. That really drives corn silage, is that moisture content. And there are ranges that vary a little bit by storage type, but generally around 35% whole plant dry matter is a good target. From there, there's some key steps to focusing on retention of that dry matter, so reducing any sort of losses in storage or fermentation. And that can start with proper siting for the, making sure you have a dry, well-drained base to put the forage on, or if you're using silo bags or upright silos, making sure they're in good working order to preserve the feed. Thinking about, again, back to, our corn silage this year, is we're kind of looking at two different forages in terms of forage quality, but in general, it's helpful to think about the class of animals you intend to feed that crop to, and how you can store it so it's accessible and ready to be used for that group of animals. And then, there's some key points on storage, especially when it comes to drive over piles and bunk silos, where we want to make sure to, some of the highlights are achieving a good density to exclude oxygen, making sure you're covering with a plastic and securing that plastic onto the forage to keep the oxygen out, and also consider the use of stuff like inoculants to help facilitate that fermentation process.
Joe, just talk a little bit more about packing. That seems to be such an important aspect in putting in a good crop that does well as feed. Give us some of your guidelines for packing.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is a huge area, and in some cases it can become a bottleneck on a farm. So when we, our goal with packing is to push all the oxygen out of the feed that we can. And there's a rule of thumb that's been around for quite some time of 800 pounds of packing weight per ton of corn silage that you deliver each hour. So if you're delivering 100 tons per hour to the bunk, you would multiply that by 800, and that would be the amount of packing weight that you would want to try to have on that bunk at all times to get a adequate density. A few things to keep in mind along with that are the tractor with the blade on it that's pushing up the silage really doesn't spend 100% of its time packing feed. It's, in some cases, it can only be 50 or 60% of the time that's actually on the bunk packing. The rest of it is just pushing up or waiting for the truck or wagon to dump to push up the next load. So we don't want to credit the weight of that pushing tractor as 100% when you calculate your needs for packing weight. There are some relatively inexpensive ways to add weight in terms of adding concrete blocks to the back of tractors, keeping fuel tanks full, wheel weights. A lot of the stuff that you don't want to do in the field because it causes compaction in a field scenario is what you want to do on the bunk. Layer thickness is another important consideration that we think about. The thinner we get those layers, the better they'll pack. The University of Wisconsin has a nice spreadsheet that will predict density if you enter in your delivery rate and packing weights and all that. And if you adjust layer thickness in that spreadsheet, you can really see the impact of just how much you can gain with the same amount of packing weight by decreasing your layer thickness.
Sure. As we wrap up here, Joe, any final thoughts?
Well, I think it's one of those seasons where we want to do all the routine stuff correctly, in terms of kernel processing, length of cut, and there's some very good resources out there on that. We have some through the Pro Dairy program, and a lot of other states and universities have them, and certainly, farms can consult with their nutrition advisors or other advisors on the farm in terms of what criteria they want to meet for the crop. So we don't want to forget about that stuff, but we need to think about that in the context of what's going to happen this year and dealing with this wide harvest window and the possibility for a lot of immature forage. And real quick, finally, related to that is I think something that gets overlooked a little bit is from an environmental standpoint is when we have these immature crops, and if we harvest them at a wetter than ideal moisture content, we have the potential for increased leachate, and that's something we really want to keep an eye on, especially in states where the farms are working with environmental regulations and have practices such as leachate collection on their bunk silos or drive over piles. We want to make sure those collection systems are working properly and are prepared to handle some of this potentially wet forage.
That's great. We thank you. We've been speaking with Joe Lawrence of Cornell's Pro Dairy. He may be contacted through the Pro Dairy website, prodairy.cals.cornell.edu. And his slide set can be accessed on our website too. And his presentation will be available later on. This is Joel Hastings for dairybusiness.com.